Someone your age should consider retirement before security has to escort you out. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 43 minutes before 75 Navy personnel surrounded his hospital. Seattle General in Philadelphia hums with the usual rhythms, fluorescent lights flickering over polished linoleum, the acrid smell of antiseptic mixing with burnt coffee from the nurse's station. Margaret Walsh moves through the third-floor medical wing with invisible efficiency, her movements economical and precise, checking fours and updating charts with meticulous handwriting that fills the margins with details no one else bothers to record. She keeps a pair of worn combat boots in her locker, visible when she retrieves her reading glasses at 6:33 a.m., the leather cracked and darkened from 17 years of service across 3 continents. Her hands show faint scars across the knuckles, the kind that come from field medicine performed without gloves, from holding tourniquets tight enough to stop arterial spray, from things that don't happen in Philadelphia hospitals. There's a slight hitch in her left shoulder when she reaches overhead to adjust the 4-drip in room for 12, a reminder of the shrapnel that came out in surgery but left its memory in the soft tissue. She's been at Seattle General for exactly 6 weeks, assigned exclusively to the recovery ward, which is the kind of specificity that matters to people who follow orders. Room for 12 holds Lieutenant Commander Derek Hayes, a Navy SEAL recovering from combat injury sustained in Fallujah 3 months ago. He's 34 years old, 40 pounds below his operational weight, and he doesn't know that Margaret Walsh was his commanding officer's commanding officer. He doesn't know that the woman checking his O2 saturation at 0600 hours every morning has 3 bronze stars in a box at home. What he does know is that his wife held his hand when the infection spiked to 103.4 degrees, and that this older nurse was the one who caught it before sepsis could finish what the insurgent's IED started. The scars on Derek's abdomen form a railroad track from his sternum to his hip, the kind of scar that tells you someone had exactly 90 seconds to get from the Humvee to the trauma table at Camp Lejeune before the bleeding became catastrophic. Margaret's job is to monitor him, change his dressings twice daily, and document everything in the medical record with the kind of precision that only someone trained in military triage understands. Her charts are models of clarity. Vitals every 4 hours. Pain levels documented by the minute. Wound assessments that would make surgical residents jealous. Nothing escapes her attention. Dr. Whitfield arrives for morning rounds at 6:52 a.m. with an entourage of residents trailing behind him like pilot fish behind a shark. His expensive shoes click against the tile in a rhythm that announces him before he speaks, a man whose confidence is proportional to the dollar value of his wardrobe. The cologne arrives first, something that costs more than Margaret's weekly paycheck, cutting through the antiseptic haze like an invasion. He's 63 years old, wears a Rolex Submariner that retails for $9,200, and he believes that the hospital's quarterly pharmaceutical budget is his personal ATM. The residents move in his wake with the kind of deference that tells you they're terrified of his recommendations on their letters of reference. Whitfield stops at the nurse's station where Margaret is entering dosage information into the electronic system, his eyes scanning her charts with theatrical disdain that he doesn't bother to hide. These, he says, holding up her latest documentation for room for 12, are examples of outdated triage protocols that cost this hospital money in extended bed utilization. Margaret doesn't look up from the keyboard. Her hands continue typing, steady, even, the kind of hands that have held dying men's hands while waiting for medevac helicopters. The patient is 23 days post-op, he continues, turning to his residents. Vital stable for 72 hours. Yet we have notes here documenting every minor fluctuation as if we're managing a critical care admission. This is resource waste. One resident, the one who looks nervous, who always looks nervous, shifts his weight and says nothing. Margaret finishes her entry and closes the chart. The room holds the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. Master Chief Petty Officer Whitfield stops, and his lip curls slightly. Apologies. Nurse Walsh. Don't you have patients on other floors? She turns to face him for the first time. Her jaw is set but her expression is neutral, the kind of neutral that comes from 23 years of taking orders without the freedom to respond to them the way she's trained to. I have 3 patients, she says. All on this floor. This is a teaching hospital. These residents need to see efficient, modern protocols. Not, whatever this is. He gestures at her charts the way someone might gesture at spoiled food. Margaret doesn't flinch. She doesn't blink. The patient is stable because the protocol is working. The protocol is expensive, Whitfield says. He hands her chart back, but he doesn't place it in her hands. He drops it on the station, forcing her to pick it up off the counter. It's a small humiliation, the kind that's deniable if anyone were to question it. I'd suggest you focus on your current patients and not worry so much about documentation details that no one reads. He turns and walks toward room for 12, his residents flowing behind him like water seeking a downhill path. Margaret retrieves the chart and watches him enter Hayes's room. She can see through the window, Whitfield gesturing, explaining something to the residents while Hayes lies in bed looking at the ceiling. The examination takes 14 minutes. When Whitfield emerges, he doesn't acknowledge her. He moves down the corridor, clicking his expensive shoes against the tile, already moving on to the next demonstration of his superiority. But that wasn't the worst part. At 7:43 a.m., Margaret is restocking the supply closet in the back corridor when she hears a voice carrying down from the stairwell. It's Whitfield. He's on his phone, and he's not being careful about volume or location. The stairwell acts as an acoustic amplifier, and Margaret, standing just outside the supply room with her hands full of gauze, can hear every word with crystalline clarity. The contract was for $847,000 per quarter, Whitfield says. That assumes we're listing 47% more units than we're actually using. Yes. No, the audit won't catch it because. He pauses. There's the sound of him descending the stairs. Margaret stays motionless, her body angled so she's not visible if he looks out the door. Because my procurement coordinator marks it in the secondary ledger, and the nursing staff documents the actual usage in their charts. 2 separate systems. 2 stories. She hears him reach the landing and continue down. The quarterly audit only cross-references the primary system. It's built into the hospital's accounting structure. By the time anyone could possibly connect the documentation to the pharmaceutical expenditures, we'll have moved another $2 million through the system. Sinaloa takes their percentage, the hospital looks clean, and I retire early. The door to the stairwell closes. Margaret stands in the supply closet surrounded by the hum of the fluorescent lights, her hands still gripping the gauze packs, her mind processing what she just heard. The words form a picture: systematic fraud. Pharmaceutical overbilling. A cartel involved. And one thing that makes her heart slow to a tactical rhythm, her own meticulous charting, is the documentation that proves it. Every 4 bags she documents. Every dose she notes. Every medication reconciliation she records with military precision is part of the paper trail that connects the primary ledger to actual usage. Which means when the quarterly audit happens in 37 days, Margaret's charts will be the evidence that destroys him. If her documentation reaches the auditors, the fraud becomes visible. 2 separate systems become a crime. And Whitfield, standing in his expensive suit with his expensive watch, has just announced that he knows this is a problem. Which means he's going to solve it. Which means Margaret Walsh, the elderly nurse in room for 12, has just become an obstacle. She sets the gauze down slowly on the shelf. Her breathing remains steady. The trembling that might come to another person in this moment doesn't happen because Margaret trained for decades in environments where trembling got you killed. She has survived IED blasts that killed the men standing next to her. She has performed emergency cricothyrotomy in a mud compound with nothing but a field knife and antibiotics from a medic's pack. She will survive this. But as she walks back to her station, she understands that her assignment to protect Derek Hayes, a Navy SEAL who once took a bullet meant for her son in Fallujah, has just become infinitely more complicated. Because the man who's trying to eliminate her is also the man with access to every floor of this hospital. The man with authority over staffing. The man who can get people into rooms that should be locked. She checks room for 12. Hayes is sleeping, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of someone healing but not yet whole. Margaret charts his vitals at 8:01 a.m. with the same meticulous precision that's about to paint a target on her back. The heart monitor beeps its steady rhythm, a sound like a clock counting down to something neither of them can see coming. Grand rounds at Seattle General happened every Tuesday at 6 a.m., before the day shift caught fire. Conference room on the 3rd floor. 23 residents and attending physicians packed shoulder to shoulder around a mahogany table that smelled like furniture, polish and institutional power. Dr. Whitfield stood at the head with a laser pointer in one hand and Margaret's patient charts projected across the screen behind him in letters 6 inches tall. "Here we have what I call legacy nursing," Whitfield said, circling the vital signs with his laser. The red dot danced across Margaret's meticulous handwriting. Nurse Walsh has kept Mr. Hayes in extended observation for 18 days when standard protocol suggests 12. This costs the hospital approximately $4,000 per day in bed utilization. 4,000 times 6 days of unnecessary care. $24,000 in protocol drift. He paused, letting that number hang. All because one nurse believes the old way is the right way. Margaret stood against the back wall, hands clasped behind her back, watching his performance with the flat composure of someone who'd sat through pre-deployment briefings where men with better uniforms said worse things. Her jaw tightened. Just that. Just the jaw. Nothing else moved. One of the younger residents, early 30s, expensive watch, the kind of doctor who'd never spent 4 hours in a forward operating room with 1 unit of O-negative blood and 2 Marines bleeding out on the same stretcher, glanced over at her with something like pity. Whitfield smiled. He saw the glance. He'd been banking on exactly this kind of moment. Social humiliation worked best with an audience. With witnesses who'd carry the story through the break room like a contagion. The charting you see here represents outdated triage thinking, he continued. Ms. Walsh, he always said Ms., never nurse, never Margaret, never the courtesy of a first name, comes from an era before electronic optimization. Before we understood that every hour in a hospital bed is a liability. Before we learned that sentiment and protocol are not the same thing. He clicked to the next slide. Hayes' fluid intake and output charts. Look at these notations. Patient alert and stable, continued observation recommended. 17 times in 18 days. The same observation. The same conclusion. Different ink. One of the senior attendings, a woman named Chen who'd actually served as a surgical consultant in Kandahar, didn't laugh. She was watching Margaret, not Whitfield. Watching to see if the old nurse would defend herself. Margaret didn't. She just stood there like she was made of something harder than anger. Like she was waiting for something else entirely. 2 hours later, Whitfield cornered her near the vending machines on the 4th floor. The hallway was mostly empty, 2 nurses rounding on the far end, the unit clerk focused on her computer screen, no one paying attention. That was how Whitfield preferred his confrontations. Plausible deniability. Just a senior doctor having a casual chat with a staff member. "Listen, Grandma," he said, loud enough to carry. "I've been reviewing your file. You're what, 62? Medicare age? Maybe it's time to think about legacy planning. Let the younger generation handle the complex cases." He smiled, showing teeth like someone posing for a photograph. "Before, you know, security has to escort you out. Hospital policy. Nothing personal." Margaret selected her coffee from the machine. Black. No sugar. No conversation. The machine hissed its mechanical breath as it dispensed. She could smell the burnt undertone of coffee that had been sitting in the warming element for 6 hours. Could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, that sound like insects trapped in glass. She pressed the cup button and waited for the pour. "Did you hear what I said?" Whitfield leaned against the machine beside her, invading her space with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no in a professional setting. "I'm placing you on administrative review effective immediately. Your charting methodology is being audited. Don't come to work tomorrow until HR calls you." Margaret met his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. The kind of stare that was meant to be uncomfortable. To make him blink first. He did. His smile flickered. Then she picked up her coffee and walked to the elevators without a word, leaving him standing in the hallway like a man who'd thrown a punch at a ghost. That evening, in the staff parking lot, Whitfield approached her car before she could unlock it. No pretense this time. Just him, her, and the sound of traffic from the street 6 stories below. His voice had changed, lower, faster, the kind of aggression that comes when the performative approach fails. You think you're clever. You think your little observations go unnoticed. They don't. I've been building a file on you for 6 weeks. Medication count discrepancies. Patient complaints. Charting errors. By next month, you won't just be fired. You'll be referred to the nursing board. Career over. Do you understand? None of it was true. The discrepancies didn't exist. The complaints hadn't been filed. The charting was perfect, which was precisely the problem. Margaret's meticulous documentation, maintained during her covert assignment protecting Derek Hayes, had accidentally created a perfect record of 6 weeks of pharmaceutical transactions that didn't match the hospital supplier's invoices. Her notes showed exactly when Whitfield's overbilling scheme accelerated. When he'd started inflating orders by 30%. When he'd begun splitting markups with outside vendors. But she couldn't tell him that. Couldn't explain that her detailed charting wasn't obsessive neurosis, it was tactical competence. Surveillance tradecraft. The same attention to detail that had kept 7 Marines alive in Fallujah by documenting every medication interaction in a forward aid station where the difference between a 2 mg dose and a 5 mg dose was sometimes the difference between walking and being carried out on a stretcher. She said nothing. Just opened her car door and sat down. The seat was cold even though the day had been 94 degrees. She put her hands on the steering wheel, scarred hands, calloused across the palms from decades of trauma shears and 4-line insertions and other things Whitfield would never understand, and waited for him to leave. He did, after 30 seconds of silence. He'd expected anger or defensiveness or at least some acknowledgement of his threat. Instead, he got a woman who wouldn't look at him, wouldn't speak to him, wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. It infuriated him. It made him feel smaller. It made him certain she was dangerous. That night, alone in her apartment 3 blocks from the hospital, Margaret didn't turn on the lights. She sat on her couch in the dark and checked her secure phone, the one with the Pentagon line, the one buried in a locked drawer at the bottom of her closet, and saw nothing but silence. No orders. No updates. No indication that her assignment was anything other than what she'd been told: observe and protect, document what you see, wait for further instructions. She had no authority to report Whitfield's fraud. She wasn't here as an investigator. She was here as a guardian, nothing more. The phone stayed dark. She put it away and sat in the silence, hands steady, breathing controlled, waiting. But at 11 p.m., when Margaret returned to the hospital to restock the supply closet on her own time, old habit, or maybe just the need to be near Hayes, to verify he was still breathing, her hands finally shook. She'd stocked this closet 1,000 times. 47 boxes of 4x4 gauze pads. 32 units of sterile saline flushes. 12 trauma shears in individual packaging, the kind with engraved metal handles, the kind that had been part of her field kit in Fallujah before she'd been assigned to this hospital, before her real mission became protecting one Navy SEAL who didn't know his guardian was a Master Chief Petty Officer just trying not to blow her cover. Her hands gripped the metal shelf, cold, smooth, unyielding, and the trembling started. Not fear. Not exhaustion. The trembling was restraint. 18 years of military discipline holding back something that wanted to walk into Whitfield's office, drop his computer on his desk, and tell him exactly what she was and why his fraud was now part of a federal investigation he didn't know existed yet. The trembling was the weight of operational security. The silence was the weight of her mission. She gripped the shelf harder and breathed through it. 3 counts in. Hold. 3 counts out. The same technique they'd taught her in SEAL training before she'd been reassigned to medical. before she'd realized that saving lives with a stethoscope required just as much tactical precision as saving them within 416 Hong Kong dollars. The supply closet smelled like antiseptic and cardboard. Like every hospital supply closet in every forward operating base she'd ever worked in. The fluorescent light above her head hummed that same fluorescent hum, the sound of institutional routine, of systems continuing regardless of what individual people wanted or feared or knew was coming. What happened next would change everything. But Margaret didn't know that yet. Nobody did. Not Whitfield, who was in his office at that exact moment making a phone call to someone he'd never met face to face. Not the hospital administrator, who'd already approved his request for a problem resolution consultation. Not the orderly in the ED who'd been recruited because he owed money to people who collected debts the way other people collected interest. 30 seconds after Margaret left the supply closet, Whitfield's phone conversation echoed through his office like a confession written in real time. "I need a problem solved," he said quietly, the door closed, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, low, mechanical, terrifying in its precision. "Room for 12. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. The old nurse has become a liability. She's seen things. Heard things. She's documented things. There's an orderly on the 3rd floor who owes money to the right people. I'll make sure he has access. I'll make sure Hayes is isolated. You handle the rest. And Whitfield, this costs money. 5 figures. We've already discussed this." The line went silent. Then a voice that sounded like gravel and bad intentions confirmed the contract. It wasn't a request. It was a transaction. By 5 a.m., the orderly would be making a call he couldn't unmake. By 2 a.m., Margaret would be standing between a man with a knife and a Navy SEAL she'd been assigned to protect. By 5 hours after that, 75 pieces of the United States military would be walking through the front doors of Seattle General, and everything Whitfield had built would stop mattering at all. But right now, at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, Margaret was just a nurse restocking a supply closet, her hands finally steady again, her breathing controlled, her mission intact. The trembling had passed. Discipline had won. It always did. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m. when Margaret heard the lock click from inside Hayes's room. Not the soft metallic whisper of a key card. The deliberate, mechanical sound of someone forcing the mechanism from within. She was 3 feet away, checking the medication pump on the 4 stand, when she saw him. Muscular. Orderly scrubs hanging loose on a frame built for violence, not hospitals. Gang tattoos crawled up his neck like vines, the kind that required time to accumulate, prison time, mostly. He held a 6-inch folding knife, blade already open, catching the fluorescent light with a dull metallic gleam. Margaret didn't call for help. Didn't reach for her badge or the panic button mounted near the bed. She simply stepped between him and Lieutenant Commander Hayes, positioning her body with the precision of someone who had done this before. In Fallujah. In dark rooms where hesitation meant your Marines didn't come home. Nothing personal, the orderly muttered, moving toward the bed with the loping gait of someone who expected no resistance. His eyes were flat, pupils dilated, pharmaceutical courage, probably. Methamphetamine or cocaine. Not drunk, which made him dangerous. Calculation without conscience. He saw Margaret's grey hair, the reading glasses hanging from her lanyard, the tremor in the hands of an elderly woman. He saw what everyone saw. He didn't see the scars. He didn't see the woman who had performed emergency field surgery in a sand-scoured tent with nothing but a trauma shear and a mission. He didn't see the Master Chief Petty Officer. Move, old lady. His voice carried the certainty of someone who had never encountered resistance to a knife. Margaret didn't move. He lunged. The blade came fast, aimed at her left shoulder, and for a moment the world compressed into its component parts, the hiss of his breath, the whisper of the knife cutting air, the smell of antiseptic mixing with something sour and chemical. She didn't dodge. Instead, she rotated into the strike, using his momentum like he was her sparring partner, redirecting the knife upward as her right hand caught his wrist with pressure applied to specific points along the radial nerve. The blade caught her anyway, a burning line through muscle and skin, blood blooming dark red against her white scrubs. But his trajectory shifted. His body went where his wrist went. He crashed into the forestand with enough force to rattle the entire machine. Glass bottles clinked. Alarms began their electronic wailing. He spun back, knife recovering, and slashed again. This time the blade caught her ribs, dragging sideways across her torso in a cut that was measured in inches and blood loss. Real blood. Not stage blood. Not the managed controlled trauma of a training scenario. This was a criminal with a knife and a payment to collect, and Margaret had 2 open wounds and a heart monitor screaming above her head. She delivered the nerve strike with her left hand, brachial plexus, the bundle of nerves that runs along the inside of the upper arm, and felt the orderly's entire right side go slack. The knife fell. He fell. Hit the tile floor hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs and the consciousness from his skull. The blade clattered once, twice, and came to rest near the window. But Hayes's heart had stopped. The monitor above his bed had shifted from steady cardiac rhythm to the flat, accusatory line of asystole. The stress, the physical violence, the adrenaline spike, the electrical chaos of a body in crisis had stopped his heart. Margaret's vision tunneled. She slammed the code button and heard it activate across the floor like a fire alarm, 3 loud electronic tones that meant a human being was dying in this room, right now, and help had 90 seconds to arrive. She ripped open the crash cart with movements so practiced they required no thought. Her hands moved on their own. Opened the anterior chest wall. Identified the anatomical landmarks. Found the pericardium. The room smelled like copper and adrenaline and fear. Her gloved hands, now slick with her own blood, positioned themselves on Hayes's exposed heart and began direct cardiac massage, actual pressure applied to the physical organ, not the sternal compressions taught in basic life support. This was the procedure that worked when everything else failed. This was what you did when a human being's pump had forgotten how to beat. 20 compressions. The heart muscle yielded under her hands like a stress ball. 40 compressions. 80. She was calling out medication dosages, push 1 of epi. And compression depth, 2 inches, maintain perfusion. And her voice had dropped into the register it had occupied in Fallujah when she was keeping Marines alive under fire and the chaos around her was just noise, just distraction, just irrelevant variables in the problem of keeping hearts beating and lungs breathing. The night shift cardiac surgeon arrived, pushed through the door at a run, and saw blood on Margaret's face and the orderly unconscious on the floor and the Navy SEAL with his chest open to the fluorescent light and his heart being manually compressed by the hospital's most senior nurse. The surgeon didn't waste time with questions. "Jesus, you're bleeding, sit down," he said, but Margaret was already calling out the next rhythm check, already positioning herself for another round of compressions. Hayes's monitor stuttered. Wavered. Then climbed back into something resembling life. A few irregular beats. Then another. Then a rhythm that could sustain consciousness, could sustain breath, could sustain the critical path back to living instead of dying. The surgeon took over the compressions and Margaret finally sat, her back against the wall below the window, hand pressed to her ribs where the bleeding had soaked through her scrubs in a spreading stain the color of Fallujah dirt. She was breathing controlled. Deep breaths through her nose. Out through her mouth. Her hands were shaking but her face was stone. Security arrived for minutes later, finding the orderly unconscious, finding Hayes's chest open, finding Margaret sitting with blood dripping onto her white shoes. An infection control nurse arrived with sterile gauze and gloves. She tried to press Margaret toward an immediate trauma evil, but Margaret waved her off with the calm authority of someone who had already assessed her own wounds and calculated survival probability. The shoulder was manageable. The rib cut was shallow, across muscle, not into the thoracic cavity. Annoying. Painful. Not fatal. She could sit. She could observe. She could ensure Hayes made it through the next critical hours. But 20 minutes later, as the surgeons were closing Hayes's chest and the emergency had transformed into the controlled crisis of post-operative care, Dr. Whitfield appeared in the doorway. Not alone. 2 board members stood behind him, both in business casual despite the 3 a.m. hour, their faces carrying the particular expression of hospital executives who had been dragged from warm beds to deal with a crisis. Whitfield's expression was different. It was hungry. He had the look of a man who had just been given exactly what he needed. "Security is documenting everything," he said, his voice steady, conversational even. The 2 board members stepped inside and closed the door. One of them, a woman Margaret recognized from an orientation 6 months ago, was already reading from a tablet, scrolling, her eyes moving across what Margaret knew would be fabricated disciplinary records. Records that had been sitting in a locked file, waiting for the right moment. Records created for this exact moment. That was an assault on hospital property, Whitfield continued, nodding toward the unconscious orderly being wheeled out by the trauma team. "And look at this." He opened a file folder. Margaret could see her own handwriting on the pages inside. Her medication counts from the past 3 weeks. Circled figures. Annotations that suggested discrepancies. Medication administration irregularities. 6 instances of unaccounted dosages. 7 if we count the ones that show up in your personal locker. He wasn't looking at her. He was playing to his audience. His real audience. The board members. "I brought concerns to the pharmacy director 3 weeks ago. Recommended immediate investigation. But I'm sure your documentation was thorough." He smiled. "It's always thorough with you." The room held still. Hayes's monitor beeped steadily. Someone in the hallway was speaking into a radio. Margaret sat with her hand pressed to her ribs and said nothing. Whitfield's smile widened. He had expected something different. Expected her to speak. Expected her to defend herself. Expected her to give him the satisfaction of her voice rising, her composure cracking. She didn't. She simply looked at him the way someone looks at an insect crawling across a window. Present. Unimportant. Already forgotten. Effective immediately, one of the board members said, her eyes still on the tablet, "Your employment is terminated. Security will escort you from the building." A security guard was already entering the room. Margaret stood without assistance, her left shoulder screaming, her ribs on fire. The guard reached for her arm and she moved before his hand made contact, walking herself toward the door with a gait that had not changed since Fallujah, since the moment she had chosen this hospital, this assignment, this impossible mission to protect a man who was still alive because she had been standing between him and death. Whitfield stepped aside to let her pass. He was still smiling. He had won. He had eliminated the witness. The documentation was gone. His pharmaceutical operation would remain undetected in the quarterly audit. The board members would accept the fabricated records because fabricated records confirmed what they already believed, that the old nurse had been stealing medications. Easier than investigating her. Easier than asking questions. Easier than admitting that they had hired a predator. Margaret walked down the corridor toward the staff lockers while nurses watched from the break room. One of them, a younger RN named Chen, started to follow, but Margaret held up a hand. The gesture was enough. The combat boots were in the locker. She had kept them there for 3 years, ever since she had arrived at Seattle General with fake credentials and a classified mission. Worn brown leather. Scuffed at the heel. The left boot had a frayed lace from an operation in Helmand Province that she never talked about. She changed into them without removing her blooded scrubs, just pulled them on over the gauze, over the wounds that were already beginning to soak through the makeshift bandages. The security guard stood 10 feet away, watching but not touching. He was an older man, probably 60, with the kind of bearing that suggested he had served. Desert Storm, maybe. The way he was looking at her suggested he knew something was wrong. That no medication thief moves like that. That no medication thief sits with a bleeding wound and doesn't speak. That no medication thief saves a SEAL's life and accepts termination without a word. She walked toward the parking garage at 3:32 a.m., the time burned into her memory like a mission timestamp. The garage was mostly empty. Grey concrete. The smell of diesel and motor oil. She found her car, a grey sedan, forgettable, designed to be invisible, and sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. The trembling came then. Not from fear. Not from pain. From the specific internal pressure that came from holding everything together for too long. From pretending to be someone she wasn't. From protecting a mission while a predator walked free. From knowing that she had failed, that her cover was burned, that she had nowhere left to go except back into the world as someone the Navy would have to acknowledge. As Margaret Walsh. As Master Chief Petty Officer. As a legend that no one was supposed to know existed. 20 minutes after the attack, after the monitor had stabilized and the blood had stopped flowing and Hayes lay sleeping with a sedative drip in his arm, Dr. Whitfield appeared in the hallway outside room for 12 like a carrion bird sensing weakness. He wasn't alone. 2 board members flanked him, one in a 3-piece suit that cost more than Margaret's car, the other a woman with the sharp eyes of a lawyer who'd been called in early and didn't appreciate it. Whitfield held a manila folder that looked far too organized for 2:16 in the morning, the kind of folder that had been prepared days in advance, waiting for an excuse. He saw Margaret sitting on a chair outside Hayes's room, her scrub stained with blood that wasn't all hers, butterfly bandages visible on her shoulder where the blade had caught. "Nurse Walsh," Whitfield said. Not a greeting. An announcement. "We need to speak immediately." They walked her to the administrative conference room on the 3rd floor, the one with the mahogany table and the windows facing the parking garage. Security had already been notified. A guard positioned himself outside the door. Margaret's ribs ached with each step, the tape across her bandages pulling tight against skin, but she didn't alter her gait. She didn't touch the chair back for support. She sat when directed and waited. Whitfield opened the folder with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. Inside were fabricated disciplinary reports, 3 of them, dated across the last 3 weeks, all written in clinical language that made her feel like she was reading about someone else. A medication count discrepancy from 2 weeks ago that had been corrected within the hour and properly documented. A patient complaint allegedly from the family of a man in cardiac rehab, a man whose family Margaret remembered sitting by his bed every afternoon, a family that had thanked her specifically when he was discharged. A formal incident report claiming she'd left her station for 47 minutes during a shift when the night log showed exactly the opposite. "Your actions tonight," Whitfield began, his voice steady as an executioner's hand, engaging in physical violence with a patient care assistant, abandoning protocol to perform procedures outside your scope of practice, these constitute grounds for immediate termination of employment. He slid the papers across the mahogany table like dealing cards in a game he'd already won. Additionally, the documentation here reveals a pattern of concerning behavior that the board has decided cannot continue. The lawyer didn't blink. She slid a separation agreement across the table, the papers already printed, already prepared, already waiting for Margaret's signature on lines highlighted in yellow. Margaret could have spoken. She could have told them that the patient care assistant had come through a locked door with a knife in his hand, that she'd used a pressure point strike on the radial nerve to disable him, that every move had been defensive, that she'd saved a man's life. She could have told them she was Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, Naval Special Warfare Command, stationed here under direct Pentagon orders, that this entire fabrication was a cover-up for a pharmaceutical fraud scheme worth millions, that Whitfield had contacted outside enforcers to eliminate a witness to his crimes. But saying any of it would end the mission. Hayes was still vulnerable. The documentation she'd been gathering, the meticulous charting, the medication log discrepancies that proved Whitfield's systematic overbilling scheme, would be useless without her access to the hospital systems. Blowing her cover now meant mission failure. It meant the fraud continued. It meant the next hospital would have a different victim, and the next one after that. So she picked up the pen. Her hands didn't shake. That was the thing about training, your body learned to be steady even when your mind wanted to scream. She signed her name the same way she always did, the same signature she'd used in 100 hospitals across 100 assignments. Margaret Walsh, RN. Not her real signature. Not her rank. Not the truth. The lawyer collected the papers. The board member in the suit, he didn't even make eye contact, just stood and straightened his jacket. Whitfield smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just watched his problem disappear, who didn't know that he'd just accelerated his own downfall, who had no idea that every fabricated report in that folder had been photographed and forwarded to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service 2 minutes after it was created. Security walked her to her locker. Walked her, as if she might run. As if she might suddenly reveal herself as something other than what she appeared. As if she was actually just a nurse who'd gotten too involved in a patient's care, who'd overstepped, who'd paid the price for ambition above her station. The other nurses on night shift watched her gather her things. There wasn't much. A water bottle. A phone charger. A photograph she'd kept in the back corner, one that looked like it was from a beach somewhere, generic enough that no one would ask questions. And the combat boots. The worn pair she'd carried since Fallujah, since the day the IED had killed 3 of her men and she'd performed an open chest massage on a SEAL while his blood soaked into desert sand and rounds cracked overhead and somehow, impossibly, his heart started beating again. She kept those boots in the bottom of the locker. She'd kept them for 12 years. She kept them now. By 5:16 a.m., Margaret sat in her car in the parking garage at Seattle General, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. The engine was off. The parking garage around her was nearly empty, a few cars scattered across the concrete, a cleaning crew somewhere on the lower level, the distant hum of the ventilation system pushing stale air around in circles. She couldn't turn the key. Her hands were positioned correctly, but they wouldn't obey. Her ribs hurt with each breath. Her shoulder throbbed with a pain that wasn't quite pain, more like information, data that her body was sending her brain, and her brain was very clear on what the data meant. She had nowhere to go. The safe houses were monitored. The apartment she rented under her civilian name was already being accessed by Whitfield's people. She could feel it the way you could feel eyes on you in a crowded room, that particular pressure of being watched. Her commanding officer couldn't reach out without blowing the entire operation wider. Hayes was stable but vulnerable. The fraud documentation was secure, but without her badge access, without her position inside the hospital, the trail would go cold. Whitfield had been cleverer than she'd given him credit for. He'd turned her greatest strength, her dedication to her patient, her willingness to sacrifice everything, into her greatest vulnerability. Her phone had 6 missed calls. All from her commanding officer. All unanswered because answering would mean reporting mission failure, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. She wasn't ready to admit that Whitfield had beaten her, that a crooked doctor with a folder full of lies had beaten a Master Chief Petty Officer with 3 Bronze Stars and a Navy Cross. She wasn't ready to believe that sometimes, preparation wasn't enough. Sometimes the enemy had advantages you didn't anticipate. Sometimes they got a move ahead. The parking garage was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz overhead, that particular sound that most people stopped noticing after 10 seconds but that soldiers never did. Never. Soldiers listened to the silence underneath the hum. Soldiers waited for the moment it changed. But the room went dead silent at 7:04 a.m. when someone in the hospital turned on a television in the lobby, and the news broadcast cut to breaking news, and Margaret's face filled the screen. The hospital lobby television flickered to life at 7:04 a.m., cutting through the ambient hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythm of the admissions desk. Breaking news crawled across the bottom of the screen in white letters. A decorated Master Chief Petty Officer. Missing from her protection detail assignment. And then the photograph filled the entire monitor, Margaret Walsh, in dress uniform, Navy Cross visible against her chest, eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic, jaw set like someone who'd seen things that would break ordinary people. The nurse at the front desk gasped. Then the receptionist. Then every person in the lobby who recognized the face they'd watched shuffle through these corridors for 6 weeks in wrinkled scrubs and quiet competence turned toward the television in unison, their confusion visible, audible, whispers spreading like shock waves through the building. Margaret sat on a bench outside the ER in civilian clothes, combat boots in her lap, watching the news coverage without moving. She could feel the weight of recognition spreading through the hospital like radiation, could hear the silence that precedes everything changing. Her phone had buzzed 18 minutes ago with a single text, "Valkyrie activated." She knew what that meant. Cover blown. Identity exposed. The mission's endpoint had arrived whether she was ready or not. The first wave of military personnel arrived at 7:12 a.m. Not sirens, not spectacle, just the precise, fluid movement of trained soldiers entering through the main lobby entrance. 75 Navy personnel in dress uniforms, moving with the terrifying efficiency of people who knew exactly where to go and what to do. They secured the stairwells. They filled the lobby. They positioned themselves at every elevator, every exit, every point of vulnerability. No one stopped them. The hospital security guards, the ones who'd escorted Margaret out 5 hours earlier with her badge, watched in stunned silence as the Navy took over their building with the quiet authority of an institution that didn't require permission. A staff sergeant approached Margaret's bench. His boots were polished to a shine that caught the fluorescent light. His uniform was perfect. But his eyes were wet. He stopped 3 feet away and said one word, "Valkyrie." The name hit like a defibrillator paddle against a flat-lined heart. That wasn't a question. It was activation. It was the moment the mission terminated and the woman underneath the nurse's disguise stopped pretending to be someone smaller, quieter, less dangerous than she actually was. Margaret stood slowly, the combat boots still in her hands, and when she turned to face him fully, the staff sergeant straightened and saluted, fist to chest, the sound crisp and final. "Master Chief Petty Officer on deck," he announced, his voice carrying through the lobby like a command over a radio frequency. The silence that followed was absolute. The nurses froze mid-step. The residents stopped breathing. The board members who'd rubber-stamped her firing began to understand, in that moment, that they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. This woman wasn't a nurse they'd terminated for improper conduct. She was a legend walking in their midst, and they'd watched her bleed and then thrown her out. A rear admiral emerged from the crowd, his uniform heavy with medals, his face the kind that had made decisions that affected thousands. He stood before Margaret with a tablet in his hands and began reading citations aloud. His voice was steady, formal, the voice of institutional authority speaking truth into a room full of lies. Bronze Star for decisive action under fire in Fallujah, 2007. The assembled Navy personnel stood motionless. Not a single person moved. Bronze Star for exceptional leadership and tactical coordination, Jolin District, 2008. Someone in the crowd sobbed. A nurse in the back pressed her hand against her mouth. Bronze Star for direct intervention preventing civilian casualties, Route Michigan, 2009. And then the rear admiral paused, and the silence stretched, so thick you could operate in it, so complete it seemed to squeeze the air from the room. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism under fire. Fallujah, June 15, 2009. For administering emergency battlefield blood transfusion under active enemy fire despite 2 severe lacerations to her own body, thereby saving the lives of 6 combat personnel including her own son, Petty Officer First Class Michael Walsh. The room didn't just go quiet. It broke. Nurses wept openly. The veteran security guard, the one who'd walked Margaret to the exit, sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. The board members looked at their shoes. And Lieutenant Commander Derek Hayes, the SEAL Margaret had protected, was wheeled into the lobby on a hospital bed by 2 orderlies, still recovering from his injuries, still connected to monitors and saline drips. He looked at Margaret directly, and his voice, rough from the trauma, still weak from blood loss, carried across the lobby. "This woman performed emergency cardiac massage on me at 2:17 a.m. She saved my life. But that's not why I'm here." He paused. The room held its breath. In Fallujah, she put her own blood into my arm while rounds were still coming in. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about her own injuries. She thought about 6 men who needed to walk out of that desert alive, and she made sure we did. Every single one of us. I've served 23 years. I've earned medals myself. But this woman earned hers in the dirt, under fire, without any recognition, without any fanfare. She earned it in a place where heroes don't get thanked by the public, don't get parades, don't get anything except the knowledge that they did what they were supposed to do. He looked directly at Margaret, and the tears streaming down his face weren't from pain. "Thank you, Master Chief." The assembled Navy personnel rendered a salute in unison, 75 right hands moving to 75 foreheads simultaneously, the sound like a single heartbeat. Margaret didn't move for 3 full seconds. Then she saluted back, and the gesture was so precise, so controlled, so perfectly executed that it cut through the emotional weight of the moment with the clarity of a surgical blade. That was when the FBI agents entered. 2 of them, maybe 3, the exact count became unclear because everyone's attention snapped to the moment. Dark suits. Serious faces. The kind of presence that made hospital staff instinctively step backward. The senior agent, a woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen corruption up close and personal, walked directly toward Dr. Whitfield's office. She held a tablet in one hand. The access logs were already pulled up. The digital trail was already documented. And she was moving with the confidence of someone who had every piece of the puzzle sorted and arranged. Dr. Whitfield emerged from his office at 7:28 a.m., pale, sweating through his designer shirt, his carefully maintained composure crumbling like a building imploding inward. He saw the Navy. He saw the FBI. He saw Margaret standing in the center of the lobby in full uniform in his mind, even though she was still wearing civilian clothes, and his body language shifted from professional arrogance to something closer to panic. There's been a misunderstanding," he started, his voice climbing an octave. "I wasn't informed of any military assignment. Hospital policy requires." The rear admiral stepped forward, and his voice cut Whitfield off like a scalpel through tissue. "Master Chief Walsh was operating under authorized cover for a Naval Criminal Investigative Service operation. You terminated a federal agent in the course of her duties." The FBI agent raised her tablet. The screen showed the hospital's personnel database. The access logs. The unauthorized changes Whitfield had made 30 minutes ago in a panic, trying to delete the fabricated disciplinary reports, trying to erase evidence, trying to rewrite history on a system he didn't understand. A federal system. A system that flagged unauthorized changes and created audit trails that couldn't be altered or destroyed or explained away. "Dr. Whitfield," the FBI agent said, her voice flat and professional, "you accessed this system at 6:58 a.m. today and attempted to alter personnel records. The hospital database is a federal system due to employees with security clearances. That makes your actions a federal crime." Whitfield's face went from pale to the color of spoiled meat. His eyes darted toward the board members who'd supported him, who'd signed off on his firing of Margaret, who'd rubber-stamped every decision he made. And as he watched, they stepped backward, physically creating distance, breaking the alliance, abandoning him to his own consequences. The FBI agent's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and something shifted in her expression, a confirmation of something worse than what they'd already found. "We've also connected the personnel database access to your pharmaceutical supplier. Master Chief Walsh's patient charts documented orders that match an ongoing investigation into healthcare fraud spanning for years. The total is currently estimated at $2.4 million. Whitfield's phone rang. He didn't answer it fast enough, the call went to voicemail, and the message played aloud because the FBI agent was holding the device. "They're asking about the invoices. They're asking about the kickback percentages. What do I tell them? What do I tell them?" The pharmaceutical supplier's panicked voice echoed through the lobby. Someone had flipped. Someone had cooperated. Someone in the supply chain had decided that going down alone wasn't worth the loyalty Whitfield had built on lies and manipulation. Dr. Whitfield's legs buckled. Not metaphorically. His knees actually bent, and for a moment he looked like he might collapse onto the tile floor. Security approached, the same veteran guard who'd escorted Margaret out, the same man who'd turned away to let her leave with dignity, now with tears streaming down his face as he stepped aside to let the FBI through. "I was protecting this hospital's financial interests," Whitfield's voice rose to a shout. "She was costing us thousands in extended care. I have rights. I have?" You have the right to remain silent, the FBI agent said, producing handcuffs. Not roughly. Not with dramatic flair. Just with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. The perp walk took 90 seconds. Dr. Whitfield in handcuffs, his expensive shoes scraping against the tile floor, the sound sharp and final, like the sound of a door closing on a life that was effectively over. They walked him past every nurse he'd belittled with dismissive comments about efficiency and cost-benefit analysis. Past every resident he'd humiliated during grand rounds. Past every patient family he'd treated as an inconvenience to be managed rather than human beings deserving of compassion. And not one person spoke. The silence was more devastating than any jeering could have been. It was the sound of universal judgment rendered without words. Margaret watched from the bench, still composed, her face showing nothing. Hayes was wheeled beside her by an orderly. "You didn't have to keep your cover," he said quietly. "You could have identified yourself. You didn't have to let them fire you." Margaret touched the combat boots in her lap, her fingers tracing the worn leather like someone reading Braille, learning a story told by scuff marks and faded laces. "The mission was to protect you and document the fraud," she said. "I did both." 2 years later, someone spotted Dr. Whitfield selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall in Delaware. His medical license was permanently revoked. The fraud charges resulted in 8 years of probation and $340,000 in restitution he'd never be able to pay. He sold insurance policies from a folding table to people who didn't know his name, didn't know his crimes, didn't know he'd once run a hospital like it was his personal kingdom. Meanwhile, Seattle General dedicated an entire wing, the Master Chief Margaret Walsh Memorial Wing for recovering service members. Her combat boot sat in a shadow box near the entrance, beside her Navy Cross citation. The plaque beneath read her final words to the nursing staff on her last day before returning to active duty: "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most." Margaret returned to active duty, promoted to Command Master Chief Petty Officer. Her son, fully recovered, served another 4 years before retiring to become a physician at a military hospital. And every November 11th, 75 Navy personnel returned to Seattle General's lobby, standing in silence for exactly 10 seconds, honoring the nurse who bled for one of their own and never broke cover until the moment the truth had no choice but to emerge. If you believe that quiet heroism deserves recognition, that courage doesn't always announce itself loudly, subscribe to this channel and share Margaret's story with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below, have you ever been judged by someone who had no idea who you really were?